Hi guys, today we're going to talk about macromolecules. First, let's talk about what macro means. Macro means large, so we're going to be talking about large molecules. Another way that we can think about macromolecules is also to call them polymers. Poly means many, and a polymer would be like a beaded necklace where you have individual beads that make up the longer strand. Polymers would be macromolecules because they're going to be large, but not all macromolecules are going to be polymers, and we will talk a little bit more about that when we talk about lipids. All right, speaking of lipids, it is one type of organic compound or macromolecule that we're going to be discussing in future lectures, along with carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins. So when we're trying to make these molecules, what is the process that we're going to use? Well, we talked about the process of dehydration synthesis in a previous lecture, and dehydration synthesis would just be an example of a process called polymerization. Okay, poly means many again, and basically what we're doing here is we're just making large molecules by removing molecules of water in that process. So, speaking of dehydration synthesis, so let's take a look. Dehydration synthesis, dehydration is the removal of water. So when you think somebody's dehydrated, they lack water. And synthesis means to put something together. Synthesis means a process of creating something. So in this case right here, we're going to take two monomers. Monomers are going to be the single or individual units of polymers. And in this case, each of these has a reactive group and OH group. And if you take a look, you see the ones that are listed in red. And if you were to pull those out, kind of imagine H, H, and O would be your H2O or your water. And as a result of that, you're going to build this larger molecule. Now, this molecule here only has two parts, so we wouldn't necessarily consider this a polymer, but if we continue to add new monomers each time through the process of dehydration synthesis, ultimately we would get a larger molecule, and for that one we would call it a polymer. Now, what if we want to break these things down? So if we're trying to break these things down, we're going to use a process called hydrolysis. Hydro means water, lysis means to loosen or to break. And so taking a look at hydrolysis, we can see here that it's basically just a reverse reaction of the dehydration synthesis that we just mentioned. Okay, so we take that dual molecule here, we're going to add water back into this location here, and then notice that we get our reactive groups HO on one side and OH on the other, and we've now broken it back down. Again, that's called hydrolysis, which means to loosen or break something with the addition of water. So as I mentioned earlier, these two processes are opposite reactions, and looking at the diagrams, I think that you can clearly see that in one case where we add water in, we're going to break something apart, but if we take the water back out, we're going to build it back up. Alright, so now let's look at carbon. So carbon is an element, and carbon as an element has an atomic number of 6, which is going to be equal to the number of protons. If you look here, you only see 4 in this particular image of the nucleus, but ultimately what we actually have are 6 protons, and there are actually 6 neutrons. So 6 plus 6 is 12, and so that means that this particular atom of carbon has an atomic mass of 12. Now around the carbon nucleus, we've got our electron shells, and in this case we're going to have 2 shells. Remember from an earlier lecture, you can put 2 electrons in the inner shell, and then the next shell could have up to 8 electrons, but in this case we only have 4 because carbon has a total of 6 electrons as a neutral atom. Now what this means is that since this outer shell could hold 8 and carbon only has 4, it really needs 4 extra electrons in order to be stable, which means that it can form 4 stable covalent bonds. And this is kind of an interesting and unique thing with carbon, that it can actually form bonds with other carbon atoms in rings or chains. So taking a look at these structures here, these are for monosaccharides, which are going to be simple sugars. Those are carbohydrates that we'll be talking about in a future lecture. If you take a look here, you don't necessarily see all the carbons that they have, but that's just because we're using a little shorthand process over here. So actually everywhere where these lines meet, these would all be carbons. So this would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbon atoms. All right, and then if you continue to count, you'll see that there are 6 oxygens and 12 hydrogens. We'll talk a little bit more about the ratio of atoms when we get into the actual organic compounds in future lectures. Over here, the same molecule is in a ring form, and so again we would have our 6 carbons. There would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 out here. All right, so again, the importance of carbon is that it's going to be found in organic compounds. So the carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins we mentioned earlier, those macromolecules, those will be organic because they do contain carbon. And they're going to be based on a backbone of carbon atoms. Okay? I hope you guys got something out of this lecture. If you have any questions after the lecture, please feel free to email me or bring those questions to lecture. So that we can clarify any things that you need clarification on. And I'll see you guys in class.